welcome Cecile Malaspina, our keynote speaker for the day, and over to you, Shubhro.
Good afternoon here. Good morning there, Cecile. We are happy to host you in this event. Today, we are going to have the third day of our event. So, to briefly introduce Dr. Cecile. Cecile Malaspina is Directeur de Programme at the Collège International de Philosophie Paris and visiting research fellow at King's College London, where she is running an open access research seminar titled An Aesthetics of Noise, hosted by the Departments of French and Digital Humanities. She is the author of An Epistemology of Noise, published from Bloomsbury in 2018, and the principal translator of Gilbert Simondo's famous book On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects in English, which was published by Minnesota University Press in 2017. We are happy to host Dr. Cecile Malaspina for our keynote. I now hand it over to Cecile Malaspina for her talk. Cecile, your microphone is off. You have to turn it on.
There we go.
In the middle of the screen. Yeah, it's on now. Yeah.
Okay. Okie dokie. So thank you so much, Shubhro, for inviting me, and also Paramita Mukherjee in the Institute of English Studies and Research at Amity University in Kolkata. It's a huge honor for me to be invited to be among such esteemed colleagues, and I hugely enjoyed the last 2 days. So I'm going to dive head first into my proposition for today. The humanities have an odd status with respect to the natural sciences, medicine, and engineering. This is not least because the heart of the humanities is an empty place, conceptually speaking, because the notion of the human is what each of the human sciences deconstructs. The fragments that are left are hardly a bedrock for the plurality of the human sciences. Now, ecological thinking today seems split precisely with regards to situating man in nature. Two visions of man clash in the twilight of the ecological crisis we're facing. Man has long enjoyed the status of rational animal, capable of dominating nature and entitled to exploit it to his advantage. Many continue to place their trust in man as a singularity within nature, a change agent, capable of determining the course of nature. Progress in science and technology is trusted to see our species through the ecological crisis. On the other hand, the climate crisis has unmasked man's superiority as bankrupt. Man's place seems no longer at the apex of the natural order, but at the center of its unfolding disorder. The emancipatory promises of the Enlightenment have disappointed. Many are disgruntled with its lofty claims to universality, and the rapid advances in science and technology are blamed for the unraveling ecological crisis. The catastrophes inflicted by mankind on fellow humans and on nature have hollowed out the triumphant vision of man. And the solution is no longer sought in man's singularity, but in the acknowledgement of his place among the other species, not in pride, but in man's newfound humility. The ethos of this vision of man is that unless we understand our place as one among the other species, pride will be the downfall of mankind and of the natural world as we know it. Now, man's place within nature seems undecidable, and this undecidability seems to translate into indecision. At a time when clear thought and decisive action are of the utmost urgency, the relation between man and nature presents itself as an irresolvable contradiction. We could call it today's aporia. Simondon's originality with respect to this problem lies in the thoroughness of his effort to think nature. But to understand this, we must take stock of the paradox that haunts the reception of his thought. On the one hand, he is known for his theory of individuation, and on the other hand, he is known for his philosophy of technical objects. Many, in fact, present Simondon as a philosopher of technology, and this is certainly a striking feature of his thought. Academic philosophers in the 1960s would have been startled by the technical details of light tubes, engines, or power plants in a book of philosophy. Even today, readers from the humanities are perplexed by the modes of existence of technical objects. A book I was fortunate to translate with the help of John Rogoff, after a partial translation by the Melampis had been available online for many years. Now, Simondon's philosophy is voracious of the concreteness of technology in a way that is certainly untypical of the humanities. But it is also unself-consciously metaphysical in a way that few in the humanities would still feel comfortable with. Nothing, in fact, could seem more unlikely than the assiduous attention to technical objects in the context of a return to metaphysics. It flies in the face of the virulent critique of metaphysics, which cybernetics and systems theory were designed to replace. It is out of sync also with a structuralist dismantling of the great legacies of Hegel or Bergson that were contemporary to Simondon, or rather this dismantling. What is more, Simondon's relaunch of metaphysics pivots on a distinctly scholastic problem of medieval philosophy, the principle of individuation. To read Simondon, you must strive to become a contemporary of the technical reality of your time. But to understand the place of nature, of man's technical endeavors in nature, you must be open to return to metaphysical speculation. Whatever concept of nature we hope to find in Simondon, we must bear this in mind. In Simondon, the question of man's place within nature is linked to this paradox of seeking to understand technology and of thinking about the metaphysics of nature. I will distinguish several ways in which Simondon uses the concept of nature. The first refers to the natural world we observe around us. The second refers to the productive forces of the cosmos, to physis, to what the Greeks called physis, and to Anaximander's concept of the unlimited, or apeiron. Lastly, nature also refers to the idea of general nature, meaning the universals according to which we discern individuals as belonging to genera and species. To see man's place in nature and man's relation with the other species through the lens of individuation, we have to ask how individuation articulates these three ways of thinking about nature. Now, Simondon most prominently criticizes Aristotle for his vagueness in this regard. It's not enough to say that form is the active principle that brings forth the individual from matter. Aristotle is said to neglect the dynamic relation between matter and form and to underestimate the implicit forms, the tension and the potential that already act in matter. Simondon also criticizes two other prominent thinkers of the individual, Spinoza and Leibniz. He criticizes Spinoza for dilating the concept of the individual to the whole of nature. If nature as a whole is alone to count as the ultimate individual, then all the entities we encounter lose their consistency and become fleeting and partial expressions of nature. Simondon also criticizes Leibniz for reducing the individual to the monadic singularity, such that the entities we encounter are merely derivative aggregates. Both Spinoza and Leibniz, he says, are wrong to suggest that the individual is a given, be it as a given all-encompassing individual or as a given elementary monad. Simondon thus frames the problem of individuation with three main references. They're not by no means all the references, but three main references are Aristotle, Spinoza, and Leibniz. But this is like telling the beginning of a story and the end of a story without telling the story itself. In fact, Aristotle is only the prehistory of the problem of individuation. Spinoza and Leibniz, on the other hand, mark the closure of this problem and at the same time the beginning of early modern European philosophy. Spinoza and Leibniz, in fact, intervene when the question of individuation seems already as good as settled. For the early modern philosophers, it is an axiom that what exists exists by virtue of being an individual. So what is left out from Simondon's triangulation is a debate around the principle of individuation that animated Arabic and Latin scholars, and that was to have a defining influence on Western thought. The thorough formulation of the problem was the fruit of a debate that culminated in the 12th and 13th century. And personally, I think that the defensive reaction to aspects of Arabic interpretations of Aristotle, most notably Avicenna and Averroes, or Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, culminated in Aquinas' famous expression, "This man thinks." And I think it prompted the distinctive form of Western individualism that made Descartes' cogito ergo sum, or I think therefore I am, a self-evidence. But this is another story that needs to be told, but it needs to be told another time. So what is individuation about? To inquire into the principle of individuation is to look for the necessary and sufficient cause of individual singularity. When does a being count as an individual so that it cannot be divided into parts without losing its nature? Although I may lose an arm or a leg in an accident, I would not therefore lose my individuality. But my severed arm or leg would not have the same status as an individual. The question therefore is more complicated than to say that the individual is what is indivisible. Some individuals, like the sea cucumber, can be sectioned into pieces, and each part forms a new individual. Now, when you look at the resulting duplicate of the sea cucumber, you could ask, by what virtue is the identity of an individual non-transferable to another individual, even if the other individual results from a division of the first or from its reproduction? What is it that makes an individual unique, even if they have, for instance, an identical twin? If the common nature of a cat, for instance, is instantiated in many cats, how come the individuality of my cat cannot be instantiated in any other cat? In other words, why can the individuality of Socrates never be instantiated in another being? And finally, is the principle of individuation a real feature in individuals, or is it merely a concept in the mind of the observer? And while we're at it, are there only physical individuals, in re, as the Latins would say, or does it make sense to speak also of individuals that exist only in the mind or in intellectum? The complexity of the question of individuation prompted the 13th century philosopher Duns Scotus to coin the term hexaity, or thisness. For Scotus, this principle of hexaity had to be unique for each individual. Now, Simondon famously says that in order to understand individuality, you have to account for the genesis of the individual. His entire method is aimed at demonstrating that individuation cannot be thought in isolation from the reality from which it emerges. But what is sometimes underestimated is that this question of individuation is not only about ontogenesis in general. It is about the uniqueness or hexaity, as a result of which a particular becomes this individual and no other. I'd like to direct you in this context, by the way, to Jorge Garcia's edited volume called The Individuation in Scholasticism, which is a very beautiful book that clearly expounds this whole problem. Now, Simondon shows that individuality owes its singularity, its thisness, to the co-evolution with a reality that is never abstract generic matter and that is never an indifferent milieu. The individual results from the transformation of a reality that is already rich in singularities, rich in latent forms, rich in tension and potential, and that continues to be associated to the individual as its milieu. We can now understand Simondon's high fidelity to the details of processes of individuation, his attention to the physical reality of individuation, to biological nuances, and also to psychic and social individuation in humans is painstaking. The entire edifice of his theory, from physical to biological, psychosocial, and technical regimes of individuation, reveals a method of close reading of empirical reality. At each level, in each regime of individuation, he pays the most careful attention to the singularities that intervene as the necessary and sufficient causes for individuality to emerge as a thisness. Simondon never dismisses aspects of individuation that cannot be generalized. He acknowledges the complexity of the reality from which the individual emerges and of the emerging individual itself. The philosopher's task in this matter is to discover functional invariants, such as the role of tension, potential, or metastability in every form of individuation. It is these invariants that allow us to account for fundamental aspects of individuation, without thereby having to neglect the singularity that is unique to the nascent individual and to the reality from which it emerges. So now to the concept of nature. As a consequence, also the problem of man's place in nature is not a simple one. If we want to address today's paradox of man's place within nature and his relation to the other species, we have to nuance also our understanding of nature. I'm going to start with the first, most common understanding of nature. When we speak of nature, we usually refer to our natural environment. Simondon usually refers to it cautiously as the world. He differentiates, for instance, the geographical world from the human world, and he defines both as particular regimes of elements. It is this idea of nature as a specific regime of elements that Simondon refers to also with respect to technical objects. The technical object mediates, he says, between, I quote, the natural world and the human world. Simondon even defines the technical object as the true mediation between nature and man. However, while most of us speak of nature as the general environment, Simondon most often has a specific and localized concept of nature in mind, a certain regime, he says, of natural elements surrounding the technical being. And this specific nature is the milieu that is associated with what he calls a certain regime of elements that constitute the technical being. But there is also a second understanding of nature at work in Simondon's thought, and this is not empirical but metaphysical. This is when Simondon thinks about nature as the ground for individuation. Here, nature is defined by its function. It's a functional concept, not by a particular regime of elements, and even less as limited to the terrestrial biosphere that surrounds us. This functional concept of nature does not necessarily oppose the natural to the artificial, nor does it exclude the presence of an individual, provided this individual is here considered insofar as it acts as the ground for another process of individuation. A living being, for instance, a living individual, can become part of a collectivity. Several individuals together can act as the ground for an additional individuation of the collectivity, bringing about, for instance, a colony of polyps that form a coral or a community of human individuals. This collective individuation takes place on the basis of the first, just as all vital individuation takes place on the grounds of pre-existing physical, chemical, and biological processes of individuation. Nature, by this account, as a functional concept, is neither reducible to a given fauna and flora, nor to the regimes of elements that we call our own ecology, nor does it extend to the universe in its entirety. The pre-individual is whatever lends itself to a specific process of individuation. It is whatever is yet undetermined it is whatever is yet undetermined in the individual, and can thus act as what Simondon also calls unrefined nature, or nature brute. Raw or unrefined nature in this sense is a functional concept of nature as what is pre-individual, both in the sense of what is not yet individuated and in the sense of its proneness to further individuation. Even technical objects can act as such a nature brute. They can assume the role of the pre-individual, provided they have a margin of indeterminacy that allows for further individuations. In this sense, you could say that nature, or nature brute, is the functional margin of indeterminacy in being, but only insofar as it is not a sterile indeterminacy, but one that is subject to tension and potential for further individuation. Now, there is also a third sense in which Simondon refers to nature. This is the notion of the unlimited and the indefinite, the pre-Socratic notion of the apeiron. This is in some ways indistinguishable from the notion of the pre-individual, and yet it has a more fundamentally speculative dimension. The apeiron is not simply what remains pre-individual. It is a fundamental lack of determination, an absence of bounds. The apeiron refers to a reality anterior to the distinction between matter and form. It is the concept of primordial indivision, of oneness. The dynamism of what the Greeks called physis, that is harbored by the apeiron, is more universal, says Simondon, and more fundamental than the growth of plants and animals. To be clear, none of these three conceptions of nature make sense in opposition to technical reality. Simondon goes so far as to say, and I quote here one of the most important expressions in his thought for me. He says, there is something of human nature in the technical being, in the sense that this word, nature, could be used to designate the remainder of what is original, prior even to the humanity that constitutes man. Man invents by putting to work his own natural, material support, this apeiron, which remains attached to each individual being. End of quote. This is a striking formulation because it puts the infinite, the undetermined, at the heart of human nature. And what is more, it puts what is more than human, both in the human and at the heart of technical objects. If one were to speak of a materialism in Simondon, then the concept of matter as apeiron is where you would have to start. Now, unfortunately, I have no culture knowledge to discuss this in relation to the notions of Atman or Brahman, but I really hope that someone who does is going to put these concepts to work productively in this context. Now, back to the concept of the pre-individual. Also, the pre-individual has no intrinsic opposition to technical reality. As we have seen, any individual, and hence also the technical object, may act as ground for further individuations, provided that it harbors an indeterminacy that is not sterile. Even the first and most common understanding of nature does not imply a fundamental opposition between nature and technical reality, as it is a matter of regimes of elements in their interaction. This is not to say that there is no difference between man-made regimes of elements and those that occur spontaneously in nature. But there isn't a fundamental opposition, certainly not in the sense in which the most conservative ecologists pit nature against technology. But there is a last and no less critical use of the term nature in Simondon's thought. This is when Simondon refers to nature as things, to the nature of things as their essence. Simondon talks, for instance, about the essence of the machine, or the true nature of technical objects. It is not technical reality that alienates from ourselves and from nature in this sense, but our failure to grasp the nature and essence of the machine. Here the term nature refers clearly neither to the regime of natural elements nor to the idea of nature as pre-individual ground or as cosmic apeiron. Nature here refers to what constitutes a common nature or universal, as a logical concept that enables us to think about genera and species and individuals. But Simondon performs a reversal of the common sense understanding of human nature that couldn't be more complete, by bringing together human nature and the apeiron. What is human, what is essentially human, is what remains indeterminate and infinite within us. In other words, what is universal to all humans is the absolutely primordial infinite oneness and absence of form to which all individuals remain tributary for as long as they live. And let me repeat the quote from earlier. I quote, "This word nature could be used to designate the remainder of what is original prior even to humanity that constitutes man. Man invents by putting to work his own natural material, this apeiron which remains attached to each individual being." End of quote. And I'm going to conclude soon. In the context of today's identity politics, Simondon's must strike us as an extremely ambitious concept of human nature. What does it mean to say that it is the apeiron that is the common nature of man? It means that what characterizes human nature in its essence is not the impressive brain-to-body mass ratio, not intelligence, not reason, or even language, but on the contrary, a lack of definition. If the apeiron lies at the heart of human nature, then all the normative ways to define humans according to gender, sexuality, ethnicity, culture, religion, ideology, or even fidelity to a philosophical system are contingent with respect to this fundamental indeterminacy. The question of man's place in nature, as a consequence, concerns its mode of relating to what is infinite and indefinite within the human and within all other species. The question of man's relation with the other species will, as a result, pass through this apeiron as a shared ground for individuation that cannot be determined in advance. To understand Simondon's refusal to be pessimistic about technical reality, we must see the same reversal of our common understanding of the technical object at play. The technical object bears the mark of the human, or of human nature, not because it is conceived in our image, not because its perfection is to become like us, to replace us as a robot or as artificial intelligence. What is human in the technical object is what remains open, indeterminate, and capable of giving rise to new individuations. In other words, the essence of the technical object, its common nature, is a man-made access to the apeiron. Its true nature is thus an indeterminacy that affords new individuations to arise from the mixture of human and non-human regimes of elements. And I would like to conclude here. And yet Simondon thinks this indeterminacy, in the context of the most faithful attention to the singularity of each process of individuation. In fact, the entire point of debating the principle of individuation is to overcome the superficial sense in which every individual is merely numerically one, and to dispense with vague notions like form or matter, or for that matter, in my opinion, gender or race, as principles of individuation. To ask about individuation is to ask how something becomes a this, and only this one, such that the individual can never be reduced to its common nature. While it is in the human nature to harbor the infinite, there is also, in addition to this essence, its existence. And in addition to an existence that harbors the infinite, there is also what Duns Scotus called hexaity, so that it is not existence in general, or the existence of something absolutely indeterminate, but the existence of this unique individual. Each individual, in addition to the common nature that it shares with everything that is, and in addition to merely existing like all other individuals do, also has characteristics that are absolutely singular to it. This is what gives the individual a consistency and presence. It allows the individual to hold its ground as truly existing. The individual thus has a dignity that it was denied in both Leibniz and Spinoza's philosophy. To think about human nature and about the relation between humans and other species through the lens of individuation should thus give us a sense of the absolute uniqueness of our terrestrial world and of the individuals of our own and other species with whom we share not only the human world, the geographical world, the biosphere, but also the great cosmological apeiron as a shared ground for individuation. For Simondon, it would scarcely make sense to think of collective individuation as something that is defined by particularities of gender or ethnicity. Even culture is at times described by him as an obstacle to further individuations. For Simondon, the group that is bound by work and by subsistence in the identity of the is the identity of the community. But this is very different from his conception of the group that puts what is as yet undetermined in each individual in the service of a new individuation. The latter is what he calls a society. This society cannot be confused with the vacuous universal. The form of individuation that Simondon calls transindividuation takes place on the ground of already existing individuals. It thus mobilizes both what is already determined and what is yet undetermined in each of them. If the notion of hexaity applies to the individuation of such a society, then it cannot be reduced to an abstract universal idea of society. It has to be thought as a social reality that is rich in the complex regimes of elements associated with each individual, and also rich in the as yet undetermined possibilities harbored within each individual. A society would be, and I conclude, a collectivity that is engaged here and now in resolving the tensions and problems that are specific to it, and that is capable of mobilizing the indeterminacy that all individuals share to this effect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cecile, for this wonderful talk, and also thank you for translating Simondon, because this is a very important phase, which I feel, because questioning the privileged or the privilege of individuations, as you have rightly pointed, starting with the humanist privileging of the individual, was questioned in one way by Derrida, and those been brought as another aspect of that discourse, another entry point into that question, apart from Foucault and Derrida. And Simondon at that time, as if offers other different entry point into entire that. Hello, is it coming? Hello.
Your line is very broken up on my end. I hear only fragments. I heard Derrida, and privilege, but I couldn't really hear the whole sentence. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, what I was saying is that uh, the first thing I said, that thank you for deciding to translate Simondon's on the mode of existence into English, because it enabled people like us with direct access to French to understand and connect with Simondon, and that's what I was saying, that the privileging of individuation was questioned in one way by Foucault and Derrida. Is it audible now? Yeah. And to move away from that and to find a alternative entry point into that questioning, Deleuze was brought forward, and then Simondon is offering also another entry point to that questioning of the privileging of individuation. So in that context is fascinating. I was asked to take the responses of the other plenaries or keynotes also, if they have any response to make here before we move to the question answer. Anirban Dash is also here. Anirban Dash, Professor Dash, do you have anything here to comment or add to Cecile's point? Hello? I think he's not connected. Anyhow, there is no questions also.
No, I could
Yeah,
not connect.
yes.
But all right,
Yeah.
I don't think I'll just now question, but like let others ask.
Yeah, there is no question. So also, if you want to add something, give some views on Simondon and Cecile's talk.
My connection is very, very bad practically.
Okay.
It's coming and going. Like
Yeah, there is a bit of network problem today. Okay. So there is no question as such from the participant, and I also don't have any such question immediately to ask, but yeah.
but
Just
this was fascinating. Like it's really
yeah, exactly.
very well put, the way it was, and we expected that definitely. Yeah. So I really. Oh.
We can hear you, Arivanda. Yeah, exactly. Like question as such immediately, I don't have any. But your talk was really fascinating, because the way, on the one hand, you're situating it within attempt within Greek philosophy to locate with arche, and from arche to as if questioning the boundaries, and that is how you're bringing in Simondon's context, and that is again we are bringing in the present context, how as if there is a shared sense of existence which refuses to reduce into the privileging of the individuation, but that again doesn't take away the individual. The individual is there as if without the privileging of the individuation, and that was fascinating in your talk, and how you are bringing Simondon also in this context.
Yes, thank you. I also enjoyed all the previous talks very, very much, and
so
I
think can move.
just wanted to say one thing. When I wrote this this talk, I cringed every time I used the word man to refer to humanity or mankind, and then I decided to use it anyway, because it's the most problematic way to designate the human species. And all the others, to a certain extent, are also problematic, but we distrust them less. So I thought it's best to use the one that sticks out like a sore thumb and keep it as a problem, rather than speak of humanity or the human species, which each have their own, conceptual problems attached, but we tend to be more trusting with them.
Thank you, Professor Cecile. There is no question from the participants, so we have to end it here, and we have to move to the next session, which is the plenary session on margins. And Anirbanda, you don't have anything to ask, right, Cecile? The microphone is off. I can see you. Your microphone is off. Anirbanda, your microphone is off. You have to turn the microphone.
Anirbanda, unmute yourself.
I think there is network problem.
It's coming and going.
Yeah. If you have to ask something, you can turn off the video and ask your comment, or we can move to the next session.
Move to the next session.
Okay. So thank you, Cecile, for this wonderful talk, and this was a perfect way to the way we are not only questioning the humanities as a discipline, but also the continuous privileging of individuation that as a discipline humanities also has continued for generations. And Simondon is one of those attempts among many which tries to challenge that kind of an individuation. And thank you for presenting in this wonderful way, Cecile. We are moving to the next session. I ask our head of the department, Professor Paramita Mukherjee, to take over.
And I thank you very much for inviting me to participate. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you. Paramita, you're here?
Yes, thank you so much, Cecile, for this wonderful talk. And thank you, Shubhra, for moderating the panel. So I guess next we get to hear you now reading your paper. So we will start with our next plenary session. Do we need a break, or we just go ahead and start?